Alrighty, history fans. In our most recent lecture, we examined the American Revolution, the process by which a rebellion breaks out in the English colonies in the 1770s, and how that leads to the formation of the United States, now as a separate sovereign nation. We ended that lecture with the cliffhanger question, well, if the United States wins its independence from Great Britain in 1783, and the revolution was about an effort to create a separate sovereign nation where we could govern ourselves. How? How will we govern ourselves now that we were free of British rule? Well, the immediate answer to that was something known as the Articles of Confederation, which stands as the very first government of the United States. The Articles of Confederation, if you were to look at it, bears no resemblance to the government we have today under the Constitution. And one of the big ideas, one of the big themes of today's lecture is how we go from the Articles of Confederation to the Constitution, how the Constitution ultimately is created. The Articles of Confederation is very different. It was really just a loose way of tying together these now 13 states. There was no president, no Supreme Court, no judiciary. There was a national legislature, but in order to pass a law that would apply to the whole of the nation, all 13 states, you had to get 9 of the 13 states to agree, which made it almost impossible to pass any laws because it was very unlikely that you would get 9 of 13 states to agree on anything. America is a very captious, quarrelsome nation. It always has been. There's great diversity within this nation, diversity of experience and opinion. So the common denominator in American history in many ways is debate, argument, rather than agreement and consensus. And so the idea that you're going to get 9 of 13 states to agree on anything was far-fetched. And therefore, there really wasn't a national government. It was just a loose way of tying together these 13 states. Now, we can look back at this and see it as a failure, the Articles of Confederation. It is quickly scrapped and replaced by something that has endured for over 200 years, the Constitution. Today, in 2020, we're still governed by the same government that was created in the 1780s. Yes, we've amended the Constitution many times, usually for good reasons like ending slavery, allowing women to vote. But at its core, the structure itself is the same as it was when it was created in the 1780s. That has lent a great deal of stability to the United States. Few, if any, human societies around the globe can make that statement that they are still governed by the same government that was created in the 1780s. The stability and flexibility that the Constitution has allowed, particularly through its amendments, has created a basis by which the United States can emerge as a successful and prosperous nation. So we know that. We look back, therefore, on the Articles of Confederation as a failure. It didn't work. It was quickly scrapped and was replaced by something that has endured and provided great stability in American history. But at the time, the Articles of Confederation made a lot of sense because, as we learned in our most recent lecture, the American Revolution was a revolution against a strong central authority, the king, who was seen to be violating natural rights, ideals of liberalism, republicanism, culturally rooted notions of rights associated with English citizenship. So the whole American Revolution was a revolution against a concentrated authority. The last thing that these now 13 states wanted to do was to create another centralized authority. So you have the Articles of Confederation, this very loose way of tying together 13 states without a federal government, without an overarching authority, without any sort of national government that could dictate policy to all 13 states. Though that made a lot of sense to the colonists as they emerged out of the American Revolution, there were certain problems that plagued the United States from the very beginning that could not be addressed by the Articles of Confederation. And so now we introduce some of the reasons why the Articles of Confederation will be scrapped and replaced by the Constitution. Let's go through these problems one by one and explain how these problems plagued the early republic, the United States as it emerged as independent, and how the Articles of Confederation was inadequate in responding to these crises. The United States had won its independence, but it did so at a great cost. America emerged out of the American Revolution deep in debt. We borrowed half of the cost of the revolution from France. France was thrilled, overjoyed when there was this rebellion within the British Empire, when these 13 colonies rise up in rebellion. France, still smarting from its loss in the 7 Years' War, was thrilled when this revolution breaks out. And so they ran over here eager to help the colonists and undermine their old rival, Great Britain. So France lent us 50% of the cost of the war. They also lent us the use of their navy. This helps explain how a ragtag army of 13 colonies could defeat the most powerful nation on earth. We had a lot of help from France. So the next time someone says something cheeky or insulting about the French, keep in mind we wouldn't be here without the French. The French lent us that money, 50% of the cost for the war, but they wanted their money back. So America had emerged as independent, successful in its revolution, but it also emerged out of that revolution as a sovereign nation deep in debt. And there's a lesson here that we can all understand and embrace. America was born in debt, and we've been in debt ever since. Nothing more American than debt. You know, there's a lot of hand-wringing today among some politicians about the national debt and the ever-increasing debt that the U.S. government owes. We historians, we just shrug our shoulders. Hell, we've always been in debt. I think we'll be okay, all right? We haven't paid off the debt from World War II. I think we're going to be okay. So America was born in debt. We've been in debt ever since. Nothing more American than debt. So today, when you go out to the mailbox and you open up that mailbox and you see all those goddamn bills in there, just stop and say, hey, it's good to be an American, okay? You're doing your part. You know, run up that visa, buy that plasma TV, show that you're a real American. We were born in debt. We've been there ever since. But the debt that we began our nation holding was a concern, and it was a concern that could not be addressed under the Articles of Confederation. We wanted to pay down that debt. We wouldn't pay it off. Hell no, we're Americans, okay? We're not going to pay off our debts, but we wanted to pay down that debt for two key crucial reasons. One, it would demonstrate to ourselves and the world that we were now a separate sovereign nation. There's a lot of people within the United States even, and certainly around the world, who believe that this whole United States thing isn't going to work, that these 13 states are going to go running back to the king, say, please, please take us back, that this is just a fledgling enterprise and it won't really work. Well, a separate sovereign nation, an independent nation, honors its debts. So if we started to pay down our debt, it would prove to ourselves and the world that we were capable of governing ourselves. The other reason why we wanted to at least pay down the debt was that it would allow us to borrow more money. Perhaps you had this experience. You turned 18, you got a credit card, you went out, bought a bunch of crap, and then there's that bill in your mailbox a month later. But you paid the bill. And when you do so, what do you now see in your mailbox? Offers for more credit cards. When you prove that you are credit worthy, when you honor your debts, it gives you a chance to borrow more money. And we wanted to borrow money early in our history, in the early republic, to build roads, to build bridges, to invest in the nation. So we had a lot of debt, and we wanted to at least address it by starting to pay it down for those reasons. But under the Articles of Confederation, it was impossible to pay down that debt, because to pay down debt, you need to raise revenue. You need to levy taxes. And there was no way you were going to get 9 of 13 states to agree on something so controversial, something so at the heart of the rebellion and revolution as taxes. So we had a lot of debt, couldn't pay it off, and this was a problem. Another problem concerned a vengeful Great Britain. Great Britain had lost the revolution, but they weren't thrilled by that, and they weren't too keen on their former colonies now emerging as a separate sovereign nation. So they tried to undermine the United States through trade restrictions by blockading the coast. Great Britain had a big bitchin' navy, and they weren't shy about using that navy. Great Britain was still here in North America, in Canada. So yeah, they lost the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, but they were still here. And they could use that base in Canada to vex and trouble the American economy, in particular through blockades, making it difficult for us to trade across the Atlantic. So we faced trade restrictions, and that seemed to demand a response. We need to have our own navy. We need to break the blockade. We need to open the coast so our commerce can flow across the Atlantic. Well, we could not fund a navy that could stand up to Great Britain, break this blockade under the Articles of Confederation, because you could not raise tax revenue that could pay for a navy. So these trade restrictions crippled the American economy. We were independent of Great Britain, but we didn't feel independent because they were still wielding power through these blockades against America's economic future and interests. We emerged out of the Revolution in a state of economic instability, massive inflation, as there was great scarcity after so much resources had been diverted or thwarted in terms of production during the Revolution. And so basic commodities were in scarce supply. That led to massive inflation. And under the Articles of Confederation, it was very difficult to address a lot of the economic concerns that rippled through the early republic because there was no national banking system, no national currency. Every state had its own currency. So we were again independent, but we didn't feel very free because our economy was subject to inflation and a variety of hardships, and there was no way to address that without a centralized authority. So we couldn't create a coordinated economic response that would address inflation and many of the other economic hardships that gripped the early republic. I mentioned the blockade on our eastern border, the Atlantic coast. Then there was a security concern on our western border because Great Britain, from its base in Canada, often entered into alliances with Native Americans in the West and urged them to attack the United States. This will later lead to another war against Great Britain, the rematch, the War of 1812. In 1812, we go back to war with Great Britain, in part because they were allying themselves with Native Americans and inspiring Native Americans to attack us on our western border. Well, that seemed to demand a response. American lives were imperiled. The American homeland was being raided by these Native Americans allied with Great Britain, and that necessitates an army. And we couldn't fund an army. We could not field an army again without revenue. So we created the Articles of Confederation. It was the first government of the United States. It made a lot of sense at the time because we didn't want a centralized authority, but there were these problems: debt, blockades, an economic state of disorder, security concerns on our western border that seemed to compel us to revisit the Articles of Confederation. And that process of revisiting the Articles of Confederation created a convention where two representatives from the 13 states met initially to revise the Articles of Confederation. The initial effort here was to take the articles and tweak them, revise them a little bit to make them more responsive to the problems that plagued the early republic. But it was quickly decided at this convention that there's no hope for the Articles of Confederation, that there's no redemption, that we need to just scrap it and start over. And that's why this event becomes known as the Constitutional Convention, because out of that will come the Constitution. There were two factions at the Constitutional Convention, two groups of representatives with different points of view and perspectives in regards to how to do this. The first group were the Federalists, and to make things nice and easy for you, the Federalists were those who advocated for a federal government. See, nice and easy for you history students. They were led by James Madison and Alexander Hamilton. The Federalists were the representatives at the Constitutional Convention who said we need to create a strong central authority to address many of the problems we talked about on the previous slide. They were advocates for creating a federal government that would have an overarching authority that could dictate policies to all 13 states and hopefully remedy many of the problems that plagued the early republic. One good way to understand the Federalists, just in case you're asked about this on an exam coming soon, one good way to understand the Federalists is as a continuation of republicanism. In our previous lecture on the American Revolution, we described republicanism, which was an ideology that circulated through the colonies in the 1700s that helped inspire the American Revolution. It was an ideology that said freedom, liberty comes from order, stability, like-minded people coming together, creating something beyond themselves. It is a commitment to civic virtue, the public good. So we talked about republicanism and how it inspired the American Revolution in our most recent lecture. Well, republicanism doesn't end when the revolution ends. It continues to influence American political history. Here, it influences the early government of the United States. The Federalists represented the continuation of that notion of republicanism because they argued for creating a strong central authority that would create that foundation, that stability that makes liberty and freedom possible. So they came from that perspective and became advocates for creating such a strong central authority. Another idea, another belief of the Federalists that came to influence the early government of the United States and represents, again, the republicanism that their political perspective is informed by. They're very suspicious of the common man, the masses, the great unwashed, uneducated masses of American citizens who didn't have the level of sophistication and learning and education that people like Hamilton and Madison had. They argued that, these farmers and laborers and shopkeepers, they can't be trusted to make decisions about complicated things like taxes and tariffs and banking laws. So another hallmark of the Federalist perspective was the suspicion of the common man, common people. And because of that, they wanted to make sure that the common man doesn't have much power. The Federalists were completely comfortable with elite rule. They said, guys like us are smarter, we should be in charge. And they were comfortable with that because they believed that they would always make decisions based on that notion of civic virtue, the common good, associated with republicanism. So another way in which the Federalists represented the continuation of republicanism was the way in which they were very fearful of the masses and wanted to have indirect democracy. From this comes the Electoral College. Is it possible in America to win the popular vote and still not become president of the United States? Absolutely. We've had a couple of recent examples of that. In 2000, more Americans voted for Al Gore than George W. Bush, but Bush won the Electoral College and became president. More recently, in 2016, over 3 million more Americans voted for Hillary Clinton, but look who's in the White House. And that's a development that comes out of the Electoral College, and that comes out of the Federalists' idea of indirect democracy, where we don't want mass popular democracy. Now, that might seem undemocratic to you, but for the Federalists, this will ensure freedom and liberty for all because they argued we're smarter, we elites, we know better, but we will always make decisions not for our own narrow interests, but for the common good. So that too was a part of the Federalist perspective, a suspicion of the masses, a suspicion regarding direct democracy and popular democracy. And that led to things like the Electoral College and the way in which we have a very indirect democracy in this country. We don't have a popular vote for the highest office in the land. But also that represents, again, the continuation of republicanism because Federalists advocated for this elite rule based on their confidence that elites, because they're smarter, will always make decisions with an eye for the common good. And the Federalists were advocates for creating a strong central authority because particularly Alexander Hamilton, one of the key Federalists, was keen on creating such an authority that could stabilize the national economy, create a national banking system, create one national currency, pay down the debt, invest in infrastructure. The Federalists wanted to create the strong central authority because they believe you could use that authority to create a stable economic order. That by dictating economic policy to all 13 states, you could create a foundation by which liberty and opportunity abound. And that too represents the continuation of republicanism. As we've said now many times over the course of these two lectures, Republicanism is this idea that liberty and freedom comes from order, stability, like-minded people coming together, creating that foundation by which liberty and opportunity are possible. Well, here you see that again in the Federalists and in their influence on the Constitution. Alexander Hamilton, in particular, was dedicated to creating a national banking system, investing in infrastructure, creating a national economic policy that he believed will create opportunity and prosperity for all Americans. So these are the Federalists. Madison contributed to the Constitution and its ultimate structure with an idea that also represents the continuation of republicanism, separating powers between the federal government and states so that states still have a great deal of authority and power, and dividing within the federal government three co-equal branches. Madison contributed to the Constitutional Convention this idea of a division of powers and a separation of powers. Separation of powers refers to the way in which the Constitution gives certain powers to the federal government and the federal government only, like concerning immigration. Only the federal government can enforce and create immigration policy. It wouldn't work to have 13 or now 50 different immigration policies in each and every state. So the Constitution is very clear. There are certain things that only the federal government can do, but then there are other powers that states have. And this was the idea of Madison, and it so represents, again, republicanism. As we learned about republicanism in our most recent lecture on the American Revolution, I noted that republicanism fears that one person or one group of people can become so powerful that he or they can threaten that common good, that civic virtue. And so by separating powers between the federal government and the states, you diffuse power. So there isn't just one locus of power. Yeah, the federal government has a lot of power, but states also have a great deal of power. And that's the influence of Madison on the Constitution and the influence of republicanism. Today, in the 21st century, there's a great deal of interest, a great deal of popularity regarding dystopian fantasies, right? It seems like every successful Netflix show, every novel that rockets to the top of the New York Times bestseller list, the popular cable dramas and this prestige television moment, they're all about some sort of dim future where America has been taken over by a totalitarian state. This is The Handmaid's Tale and The Plot Against America, on and on and on and on. So you've likely seen these shows. I wonder why these shows are so popular right now. Why are we all so fearful of totalitarian rule in our government? I just don't know why. But the problem with those movies and novels of some sort of grim future where someone has taken over the government of the United States is that if you wanted to take over power in the United States, yeah, you might seize Washington. It's the center of power. But there are 50 other capitals. And the head of those state governments, governors, have their own army, the National Guard. So it's really hard to imagine one person or one group of people ever taking over the United States. And that, again, was the idea behind separating powers. Division of powers refers to dividing within the federal government three co-equal branches, all of whom have different powers. The president, the head of the executive branch, has a lot of power. But there's also a Congress, the legislative branch, that has the key power to make laws. Presidents can recommend laws. They sign laws into being law, but they first must be passed through the House and the Senate. And then there's the judicial branch, the Supreme Court, the third branch of the federal government. And they have a lot of power, too, to strike down actions by the president or laws passed by Congress. So division of powers refers to dividing power within the federal government, three co-equal branches. So again, there's not just one locus of power. The president has a lot of power, but as we've seen recently, he can't just come in and do as he please. There's a court system, there's Congress, there are all kinds of checks and balances that were established by the Federalists to, again, address their fear that one guy or one group of people could become so powerful that he or they could threaten that common good. So the Federalists were one of the two factions at the Constitutional Convention. They advocated for a strong federal authority, easy to understand, just look at their name. They did so for the reasons that we talked about earlier, all the problems that plagued the early republic that could not be addressed by the Articles of Confederation. And the Federalists, with various ideas we've talked about here, a strong central authority, the ability to coordinate a national economic policy, a suspicion of the masses, their faith in elite rule, the separation of powers, division of powers, all this represents, again, the continuation of republicanism, its great influence beyond the Revolution here in the early government of the United States. Let's, in this slide, spend a little bit of time talking about Alexander Hamilton, one of the key Federalists. And we do so not only because he's the subject of a lavish hip-hop Broadway musical that everyone's fascinated by, but because he had such a great influence on early American history. He never becomes president. In fact, the clause in the Constitution that demands that you must be born in the United States to be president was written there by Hamilton's enemies so that he couldn't become president. Hamilton had many enemies, and if you've seen the musical, of course, you know that he is killed ultimately in a duel. His enemies didn't want him to be president. And so they wrote into the Constitution that clause, that demand that you must be born within the United States to become president, so he could never become president. Hamilton was born in the Caribbean, in a part of British America that doesn't become part of the United States. And so he was ineligible to become president. But he arguably had greater influence on early American history than some of our early presidents. Even though he never becomes president and he's killed in that duel in the early 1800s, he had a great influence. Alexander Hamilton was a Federalist, and he represented all those elements of federalism we talked about earlier. He believed in a strong central authority. He was very suspicious of the masses. He believed people like him, the rich, the well-born, the educated, should be in charge. But he could always reconcile that by saying, because we're smart, because we're elites, we'll always make decisions in the eyes of the common good. He believed that you had to create a foundation of laws, laws that were enforced, create institutions that overall would create stability and order, and that's how human beings would be free. We talked about this in our recent lecture as we described republicanism, individualism, everyone going their own way, no centralized authority, no sense of rootedness and connectedness. For Hamilton and Republicans like him, that's chaos. That's the opposite of freedom. You need stability, order. As he looked at the problems plaguing the early republic, blockades, attacks on our western border, inflation, he saw chaos, disorder. Let's create a strong central authority. Hamilton has a great influence in American history because he was very prescient, very forward-looking. In the late 1700s, he anticipated a coming revolution of the 1800s, which will be our focus in lectures to come, the Industrial Revolution. In the late 1700s, Hamilton predicted, anticipated a great shift in the global economy, where we would move from a rural, farm-based agricultural economy to an industrial urban economy, where people live in cities, work in factories, and make manufactured goods. Hamilton saw that coming in the late 1700s, and he wanted to put America on a footing, a foundation to thrive. Hamilton turned out to be 100% correct, as we'll see in lectures to come. In the 1800s, in the 19th century, in the next century, America will slowly but steadily shift towards an industrial economy. And a lot of the policies that Hamilton created put us in a good position to ultimately thrive as that shift occurred. Hamilton saw that coming in the late 1700s. And so he wanted to create the strong central authority that would give him power over things like taxes and tariffs. He created the first bank of the United States that could lend money to those who wanted to invest in this new economy of industrialization. Though he never lived to see it, he anticipated a coming revolution, the revolution after the revolution, the economic revolution in the decades after the American political revolution, the rise of industrialization. But he always argued that in creating the strong central authority, in dictating taxes and tariffs and banking laws, he's not pursuing his own individual ambitions and interests. He's creating that order, that stability that will allow America to thrive, become prosperous, and create, therefore, opportunity and freedom for all. It again is that idea that if you put smart, elite people in charge, they will always make decisions with an eye for the common good. And in this case, through taxes, tariffs, and banking laws, create an order and stability that will allow America to thrive in a coming revolution, the Industrial Revolution. Hamilton never becomes president, but he was our first Secretary of the Treasury. And in that position, he created the Bank of the United States. He created various institutions that helped us pay down our debt, attract more investment. He began to invest in the infrastructure, roads that will later become the lifeblood, the arteries and veins of a new mobile industrial economy. He looked into his crystal ball and he saw a revolution coming, and he wanted to create the strong central authority that could put us on a good footing to thrive with that new economic order. The other faction at the Constitutional Convention was known as the Anti-Federalists. Now, the Anti-Federalists agreed with the Federalists that the Articles of Confederation is a hot mess. You know, it's a dumpster fire. We just need to get rid of the damn thing. But they disagreed about how to replace it. The Anti-Federalists were worried that this scheme, this idea of the Federalists to create a strong central authority might replicate what we rebelled against with the king, concentrating power in a few. You can best understand the Anti-Federalists as the continuation of liberalism, which we talked about in that lecture on the American Revolution. We talked about two ideologies that are circulating through the colonies in the 1700s. There's republicanism, which continues on in the ways we've now detailed with the Federalists, and there was Lockean notions of liberalism. And that continues to influence the early government of the United States through the Anti-Federalists. They were worried about concentrating so much power in the hands of a few elites in the federal government. They were worried about individual liberty. Remember, liberals, Locke and others, define freedom not through the whole society order, but the rights of individuals to pursue what Locke described as natural rights. And the Anti-Federalists were worried that we're creating here at this federal government this idea of Madison and Hamilton, something that could potentially threaten individual liberty, as we saw with the Revolution. The Anti-Federalists were led by Thomas Jefferson, and they were deeply concerned about this issue of a strong federal government as a threat to individual liberty. And there were enough Anti-Federalists at the Constitutional Convention to stop the ratification of the Constitution. You needed to convince these guys who had enough votes to block the ratification to get on board. We were at a strange moment now where the Articles of Confederation had been ultimately scrapped, but the Constitution hadn't yet been ratified because the Anti-Federalists feared that what the Federalists were creating and proposing could again be a threat to individual liberty. They were committed to those ideals of liberalism where freedom doesn't come from government. Freedom comes by simply being a human being born in a state of nature. They argued that government doesn't give you rights, government can only take them away. And they feared creating a strong central authority in the mode, in the vision of Hamilton and Madison that could threaten that liberty. And there were enough of them to gum up the works, to stop the process. How is this reconciled? Well, by adding to the Constitution 10 amendments, known now as the Bill of Rights, that would enunciate in writing certain rights that could never be taken away. These rights, as I indicated in our most recent lecture, weren't chosen at random. They were the very rights that were taken away under the Intolerable Acts: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, protection from unlawful searches and seizures, right to bear arms. The first 10 amendments to the Constitution. Amendment simply means to add. We added 10 amendments, and we did so at the demand of the Anti-Federalists who wanted these guarantees, who wanted this in writing, who wanted a promise that what happened under the king will never happen again, that we're not going to see basic individual rights that everyone has, again, born in a state of nature, Lockean notions of the human condition, taken away by a potentially tyrannical government. And so They demanded those 10 amendments be added to the Constitution, and the very rights that they wanted to secure were the rights that had been taken away. So here's the influence of liberalism, Lockean ideals. Here is the continuation of liberalism now influencing the Constitution in these 10 amendments added to the Constitution as the Bill of Rights. And if you read the Bill of Rights, and who doesn't, right? This is how we spend our weekends, right? Gather everyone around. Let's all read the Bill of Rights. I'm sure this is what you have planned for Saturday night, I'm sure. If you read the Bill of Rights, they all begin, these first 10 amendments to the Constitution, with the same phrase, the same language that really represents, again, these Lockean notions of natural rights. Every single one of those 10 amendments begins with, Congress shall pass no law. Congress shall pass no law taking away freedom of religion, freedom of speech. And that represents, again, the Lockean liberal ideology here that government doesn't give you rights, government can only take them away, and we're going to get ahead of that. We're going to say Congress can't take away these rights. So it's really rooted in Lockean notions of individual rights, about being born in a state of nature, having those rights, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. It's another example of how our foundational documents, now the Constitution with this Bill of Rights, represents humanity in these universal transcendent terms. Now, of course, as we stressed before, and we must be cognizant of in this class, so many people in America living within the borders of this nation when the Constitution is ratified are denied those rights. Women, Native Americans, African Americans. And this again returns us to a key point I made in our recent lecture, and one I'm going to come back to, guess what, for the rest of the class. The story of American history isn't the story of democracy. It is not the story of universal rights and freedom for all. It's a story of the struggle for democracy, the struggle for freedom. And in lectures to come, in the weeks ahead, we'll see African Americans, some of them slaves, Native Americans, women come along and say, those rights are my rights too. I too am a human being. And so again, it creates this vocabulary, this language now in the Constitution, building on the Declaration of Independence, this Lockean notion of a universal human freedom that will become, in many ways, the very vocabulary of debates we'll see going forward regarding who is a citizen. What do we mean by the first three words of this Constitution? We the people. Who is an American? Who falls under that umbrella of the people, whose rights are indeed protected and secured here? The immediate impact of the Bill of Rights was to get the Anti-Federalists now on board. They got it. They got their guarantee. They got these amendments added that will assuage and address their fears about a potentially tyrannical federal government. And so this is how you ultimately get the Constitution ratified. You add these amendments, everyone's happy. The future impact, again, is one we'll see for the rest of the class. Because with this idea of rights that you have as a human being comes this argument of, well, who's a human being? If these are the rights that all citizens should be guaranteed, well, what do we mean by we the people? Who are the citizens of this nation? So the Bill of Rights had a crucial immediate impact in helping the Constitution get ratified, but the longer term impact is one we'll see through the course of the class, and in many ways is still with us today, the way in which it continues to spark debates about who is an American, who can we imagine as indeed these rights being guaranteed for. So you get what's sometimes called the Great Compromise. Everyone gets what they want. The Federalists get what they want, a strong central authority, indirect democracy through the Electoral College. Hamilton has his strong central authority by which he can begin the process of creating a coordinated economic policy that will steer America towards industrialization. And the Anti-Federalists get what they want, a Bill of Rights. Now, the Federalists always said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. It's already there. Of course, we're not going to pass laws that will take away freedom of speech, freedom of religion. Of course, we're not going to pass laws that deny people a jury trial. Remember, the Federalists, coming out of that Republican perspective, always believed that smart, elite people like them will make decisions in the eye of the common good, civic virtue. We'd never pass a law that would threaten those basic rights. But if you want it in writing, fine, let's add it. For the Federalists, it was already there. It was redundant to add the Bill of Rights because they believed the Constitution as it was constructed would always protect those rights. But they went along with adding these amendments because they needed the Anti-Federalists on board. Now, the Anti-Federalists were not a political party. They were not built to last. They were simply a group of like-minded individuals deeply influenced by Lockean theories and concerned about a strong central authority. Once they got their Bill of Rights, once they got those amendments added, they sort of fade away. Now, they don't literally fade away or, evaporate off into the ether. They're still there, they're still alive, and they're still prominent politicians in America. But they did not remain together as a movement. The Federalists were a political party, and that means that during the first 12 years of American political history under the Constitution, there's only one party, the Federalist Party, and they're in charge. Our first two presidents will be Federalists. They will appoint Federalists to their cabinets and to the Supreme Court. And so the Federalists designed this Constitution, this federal government, and they would take the reins of government and influence America in this first period, a period known as the Federalist Era, a period of one-party rule where there's only one party. Today, we take the two-party system for granted. We assume it's always been there. Many Americans think it's mandated in the Constitution. It's not. It developed organically for reasons we'll enunciate here in these final slides. And it hasn't always been around because for the first 12 years of our political history under the Constitution, there was only one party, the Federalist Party. George Washington is elected our first president. He runs unopposed. Nobody challenged him. In fact, when they were designing the office of the presidency, they had Washington in mind. They just assumed he was going to be president, and they sort of customized the role for Washington. Washington was the unanimous choice. No one challenged him. He was the guy who won a war that nobody thought could be won. He was the guy who led the effort to create the United States by defeating our rivals, the British, widely admired, widely loved across the country. He comes in, a Federalist, our first president, and he appoints Alexander Hamilton his Secretary of the Treasury. And Hamilton does what he had long wanted to do. Oh man, he's got this power, right? He designed the car, and now he's out driving the car. He created the federal government, and now he could wield that federal government. He creates a system that's designed to encourage America to shift towards industrialization. He passes laws that levy taxes to pay down the debt so we could borrow more money and invest in this new economy. He levies tariffs. Tariffs, as we've learned recently, are taxes on imported goods. One of the concerns of Hamilton was that, well, Great Britain, our rival, might just mass produce, manufacture their own goods and then flood America with those goods and make it impossible, difficult for American factories, American industries to compete. Well, the solution to that for Hamilton was to establish tariffs, where British goods imported into America now were hit with this fat tariff, this tax. Tariffs are designed to encourage you to buy locally made goods because they make foreign goods cost more. It used to be, if you wanted to buy a Honda or Toyota, it would cost a lot more because the federal government levied tariffs on Japanese-produced automobiles because they wanted you to buy a Ford or a Chevy, an American-made good. That's part of the reason why Japanese car makers moved to the United States and made their cars here. So many of the Toyotas and Hondas sold in this country are made not in Japan, but in the United States, or sometimes increasingly in Mexico. And that's because at one point we put tariffs on those Hondas and Toyotas because the federal government was trying to protect American car makers. So this has been used throughout American history, and Hamilton created them as a way to protect American industry from foreign competition. It was designed to encourage you to buy locally made goods, support American industry, help America compete against Great Britain. Hamilton created the Bank of the United States, the very first central banking system that helped stabilize the currency, allowed banks to borrow and lend to each other, again, helping to facilitate economic commerce. All this was about steering America towards what Hamilton correctly anticipated. In lectures to come, We'll talk about the Industrial Revolution of the 1800s and how America would slowly but steadily shift towards an industrial economy. Hamilton saw that coming, and he helped devise a plan that was designed to promote industrialization, where now people would live in cities, work in factories, produce manufactured goods, and sell those goods to the world. But there were some Americans who weren't too keen on that idea. And this is also something we'll talk a lot about in lectures to come. The American South wasn't too keen on the idea of an industrial economy because, as we'll talk about soon in lectures to come, at the same time in which northern states are transitioning towards an industrial economy, shifting from farming to factories, the South, in the same time period, the early 1800s, is becoming more committed than ever to slave-based agriculture. So there's this great divergence, this great divide, this great cleavage developing in the United States almost immediately after the Revolution between North and South, where the North is on the path, the plan that Hamilton created towards industrialization. The South, very different path. Again, to anticipate where we're going in lectures to come, eventually this great cleavage and divide will lead to a civil war. And you can already start to see that divide here in the late 1700s under the Federalists, where Southerners saw what Hamilton was doing and weren't too keen on it. They don't want to transition towards industrialization because they have a much more lucrative, much more profitable system, slavery. As we'll talk about in lectures to come. In the early 1800s, the most valuable asset in America, not factories, not banks, not railroads, human beings, enslaved in the Cotton Kingdom that we'll soon describe as we examine this great divergence north and south. So Southerners opposed what Hamilton was doing. And initially, that opposition was quieted, mollified in two ways. One, they created a new capital for the United States in the South. Washington, D.C. has not always been the capital of the United States. Philadelphia was once the capital of the United States. Makes sense. In many ways, that's where the revolution began. New York City was once the capital of the United States. Makes sense. It's the largest city in the country. But the reason why we have the capital in Washington, D.C. is because it was a way of throwing a bone to the South to sort of quiet their discontent with the Federalists. Let's put the capital in the South. And so land was claimed out of two southern states, Maryland and Virginia, and that's how you get the District of Columbia. It was created to give the South something as they started to express their discontent at the Federalist policies. If you've ever been to Washington, D.C., and you get a little bit beyond the mall and the tourist traps, all the tourists with their fanny packs, if you get into the city itself, you have the sense of really being in the South. It is still very much a southern city, and that's because we deliberately chose a southern city for the capital. The other thing that made the South a little less angry or willing to express their discontent at Hamilton's plan, simply the popularity of George Washington. As I mentioned earlier, he ran unopposed. No one challenged him. He's one of only two presidents to do so. He was an extremely popular figure. Americans loved him. He was the guy who won the war that made the United States even possible. He was the guy who won a war that nobody thought could be won. And so, though Southerners did not like Hamilton and his policies, they loved the President of the United States, a Federalist, George Washington, and that, along with creating the capital in the South, served during the Washington presidency to quiet a lot of the discontent of the South. But in 1796, this guy was elected president, John Adams. In 1796, John Adams wins the presidency in a close and disputed election. George Washington refused to run for a third term. He could have, but he said, I don't want to be king. And so he retired and lived the rest of his life on his slave plantation in Virginia. And so in 1796, after 2 terms of Washington, the White House, the presidency was wide open. This creates a tradition where presidents only serve 2 terms until Franklin Roosevelt will break that tradition in 1940. So in 1796, Washington retires, and we have an election where the Office is wide open, and ultimately Adams is declared the winner. Now, you'd imagine that if you win a close and disputed election, you might be humble. You might be willing to work with the other side. Not John Adams. John Adams won, and he came in. Here you see him looking suspiciously like Paul Giamatti. If you saw that HBO series on John Adams, where Paul Giamatti plays John Adams, you got a sense of John Adams' rather difficult personality. He was hated by his fellow Federalists because he had this very difficult, prickly personality. Emphasis on the first syllable of prickly. And so he wasn't George Washington. He wasn't this popular figure. He wasn't the general who won the war. And so when he continued to pursue these Federalist policies that we described earlier, that were urging America towards an industrial economy, the opposition gets louder. And Adams, with this prickly personality, this very difficult personality, was very thin-skinned and didn't like the criticism. So in 1798, he signed into law 2 laws that were designed to silence his critics. The Alien Act, signed in 1798, gave him the power to deport anyone he wanted, even American citizens. If he doesn't like you, he can boot you out of the country. And so he had great power over those who were critical of him. Keep that up. Keep printing that newspaper. Keep being critical of my administration, and I'll exile you from the country. The Sedition Act allowed him to incarcerate people who wrote materials, printed materials, or spoke out against the government. So Adams comes in. He's not George Washington. He can't rally the American people. He's not that unifying popular figure. The South continues to be very angry about many of the policies that the Federalists are pursuing. And when Southerners or opponents of Adams voice these criticisms, they're now threatened by the Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien and Sedition Acts criminalized free speech. Criticizing the government could now see you thrown in a prison. Oh, wait a minute. Didn't we just learn a few slides ago about the Bill of Rights? And the First Amendment protects freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly. Yeah, that's a crucial point for us here going forward for the rest of the class. We like to imagine here in the United States that the rights under the Bill of Rights are forever protected, forever sacrosanct. The government can never take away those rights. And yet, as we see, just 10 years after the ratification of the Constitution, you get the Alien Sedition Acts. And this is not an anomaly in American history. Though we like to imagine that those rights are protected, sacrosanct, they can never be taken away, they have been taken away time and time again in our history. There's the Alien Sedition Acts. During the Civil War, President Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and rounded up thousands of people, threw them in jail, and denied them access to a jury trial. In World War I, we passed the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act that criminalized free speech, and thousands of people went to prison because they criticized the war. In World War II, we rounded up 120,000 people, 2/3 of whom were American citizens born here, ostensibly protected by the Constitution, and we held them in concentration camps. Japanese Americans, the story of what's erroneously often referred to as internment. In the Cold War, after World War II, states passed laws that criminalized thought. There were states in the United States in the late 40s and early 50s that passed laws that said, if you're a communist, if you believe in communism, that alone could lead to your incarceration. And in 1951, the Supreme Court upheld those laws. And today we have the Patriot Act, wireless wiretapping, the government reading your emails. Have you been to the airport recently? Well, you probably haven't, not recently, but you recall flying when they're grabbing you there, touching you there. So much for unlawful searches and seizures, right? Now they want us to walk through this machine where everyone can see a picture of your dick, right? So we've given up privacy. We've given up, in many ways, the protections that are supposed to be there under the Constitution. And so the Alien Sedition Acts are one beat in a longer rhythm. We like to imagine that those rights have always been protected, but they haven't. We like to imagine that the Bill of Rights protects freedom of speech, but as I just enumerated in many examples throughout our history and continuing to this day, those rights have been taken away. When Adams signs into law the Alien Sedition Acts, it sparks a great deal of anger and discontent because For those who came from the anti-Federalist perspective, here was proof that despite the checks and balances and other protections, tyranny had returned to America. Those rights were endangered and imperiled. And so in 1800, Thomas Jefferson forms a brand new party to rival the Federalists, and he runs for president. In the election of 1800, the election of 1800 is forgotten by most Americans. Few Americans know anything about the election of 1800. Only egghead PhD types like me know anything about the election of 1800, but we should know more about it because it's important in two ways. The election of 1800 is the first two-party election, where you had Federalists against Jefferson's brand new party, a party, I know, cumbersomely and confusingly known as the Democratic Republican Party. Don't worry too much about the name of Jefferson's party. Just realize now you have a two-party election. It's the first two-party election in American history, and that's what we've had ever since. So it creates the two-party system. The other thing that's important about the election of 1800 is that at the time, it was referred to as the Revolution of 1800, or the Second American Revolution. The people who lived through this thought it will be just as important, just as remembered as the revolution that began in 1776. Now, it doesn't end up that way. As I just said, few, if any, Americans know anything about the election of 1800, but the people who lived through this thought it was just as important as the revolution against Great Britain. They called it the Revolution of 1800. Why? Because Jefferson wins. He wins the White House, wins the presidency, and ends the Federalist era. No more Federalists are ever elected President of the United States, just Washington and Adams. And the Federalists accept this. What you had in the election of 1800 is the peaceful transition of power. That's what makes it so key, so important. That's why people who lived through it saw it as important as the American Revolution of 1776. The Federalists lost, and they accepted the loss. Jefferson, their rival, is sworn in as president. You had the peaceful transition of power. In 1800, that's unheard of. The reason why it seems so revolutionary is that anywhere else around the globe, if you want to seize power, if you want to be the guy in charge, you got to do it through revolution, through bloodshed, through violence. But we didn't have that. We had the peaceful transition of power. What we proved to ourselves and the world in 1800, very early in our history, was that you could have a republic where elections choose leaders, not violence, not bloodshed. Now, again, in 1800, the only people who can vote are white male property owners. So this isn't a democratic election, but it was an election where those who could vote were the ones who selected ultimately who would be the next president. Look, history fans, we're at 1800. Another key thing to recognize here is that though we began a few lectures ago talking about Native American civilizations before European contact, we are now all the way to 1800. And that means that in lectures to come, we're about to pivot and make our way into the 1800s, into the 19th century, and we begin that process in our very next lecture.